Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why current entertainment is just so awful. And I know I've talked about that a number of times in the past, but I'm doing it today with an eye towards the future. With an eye towards how do we actually get to a place of good storytelling? How do we switch it around so that we have good stories and off of that, good entertainment? Because right now, we live in a dead zone of good entertainment. The quote-unquote progressive people still control all of the entertainment systems, but they know to some extent their narrative is not working, and so they're trying to go back to the stories that worked in the past, but that isn't working for them either. And so what we need to look for, what we need to build, is new kinds of entertainment. Well, I would say relatively new. New as in kinds of entertainment we have not seen in a long time. And it should be no shock to anyone, since my channel is based around the idea of the traditional hero, that I think those new kinds of entertainment, which we haven't seen in a long time, the way forward is through the traditional idea of a hero. But we won't get to that until close to the end of this video. But if you're looking for some good entertainment based upon a traditional hero, there are links in the description for my graphic novels. There's also a link for my new book, which is coming out, called Fade to Blue. It is the sign-up page for Fade to Blue. You can go there, watch the trailer, which some of you are watching in the background right now. You can also see some additional art and leave your email address there if you wish to be informed via email when the project goes live. But back to our topic. So in order to get to the point of how do we fix entertainment and have good stories, we have to look at the past. We have to look at why the current entertainment and current stories are not working. And further than that, what are the fundamental principles within those stories that are broken? So, taking a step back, let's look at the fact that we live in a dead zone of entertainment. Now, why is that? Well, that is because the current narrative for the last almost 100 years, I would actually say a little more than 100 years, has been the foundational myth of World War II. And I say it's more than 100 years because as someone who has a degree in history, I honestly believe in the future, most people will just see World War I and World War II as one continuous war, just with a short piece within the middle. Quite honestly, I think the Franco-Prussian War will be the proto-war for that as well. But anyways, so the point is that societies tell stories about themselves. And usually those stories are based upon some kind of foundational myth. Now, it doesn't have to be the foundational myth of the entire country or area. It can be a temporal foundational myth, and that's what World War II is. It is a temporal foundational myth. Before that foundational myth, the myth of North America, wherein stories were told, was the Wild West, was the frontier mentality. But by the time you get to the late 1800s, early 1900s, the frontier is gone. And by the time you get to World War I, World War II, those people who remember the frontier are pretty much gone. And so the living memory, not just to say the living existence, but the living memory of that old foundational myth, which was the frontier mentality, was dying out and needed to be replaced. And it was replaced by the foundational myth of World War II. And the reason why we have a dead zone of entertainment right now is because the same thing is happening now to that foundational myth of World War II. The people who fought in World War II, the living memory of World War II, is dying out. And so that foundational myth is becoming irrelevant for a number of reasons. Now, I will give credit where credit is due, insofar as I will say that your quote-unquote progressive people are the ones who have been trying to substitute a new narrative to replace the crumbling societal narrative of World War II. They've been trying to do so for the last 15 years minimum. I say 15 years because the most information I have on an entertainment system is comics, especially Marvel Comics. And it was 2009 when Marvel Comics looked at its bottom line and said, this isn't working anymore. So much so that we might cease to exist. We need to find an entirely new way to tell stories, and entirely new stories to tell. And this is exactly what they did. They went out and hired people specifically to fundamentally alter the way that they told stories and what kind of stories they would tell. And of course, the new narrative that they chose was progressivism. Now, a little caveat to that, They were indeed trying to institute a new societal narrative. This is exactly what they state over and over again within their podcast, which I've covered a number of them. But of course, it's not just comics. We can look at a number of different things that I've covered on my channel and see the same thing in other forms of entertainment. The sad puppy incident, which happened in the early 2000s, which was science fiction and fantasy authors saying, hey, wait a second, you're awarding people these major science fiction and fantasy awards because of a progressive narrative, not because they have good stories. We can look at the Southwest Book Con that I covered like 5-6 years ago, which had a panel about inserting progressive narratives into children's picture books. And that was the title of their panel. They weren't trying to hide it. You can probably still go over right now to Sweet Baby Incorporated, to their website, and see this is exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to change video games by inserting progressive narratives. And again, they make no bones about it. That's the actual language that they use. So yes, these quote-unquote progressive people have been trying to substitute into entertainment a progressive narrative for quite some time now, at least 15 years. But that's not to say that more traditional-minded conservative people are stuck in the mud and want to simply continue on with the founding myth of World War II. Not at all. It's simply that the quote-unquote progressive people are the ones, and have been the ones for a long time, for decades now, that have had, at the very least, the most institutional control over the entertainment systems, and therefore, when they chose a new narrative, they chose the progressive narrative. Quite honestly, and I know I'm going to date myself severely here, but I was in high school studying political science when the Berlin Wall fell. And I was doing my first 2 degrees in the 1990s, and I realized, through first studying history and then politics, by the mid, at the very least, to late 1990s, that yeah, this foundational myth doesn't work anymore. Mostly because it's based upon a larger liberal myth, one that has been building for 500 years minimum, one that had defeated its conservative rival almost 200 years ago. But the problem with the foundational liberal myth is they always need a bad guy, they always need an enemy to point towards to say they're the source of all your problems, and then convince the people that they are the answer to the problem of the other side. And so, roughly 200 years ago, when traditionalism was defeated by them, they still needed an enemy to point to so that they could continue to rile up the masses to be on their side. And so began the infighting of the left. First, the anarchists were pointed to as the bad guys, and so they needed to be defeated. Then the fascists, then the communists, and yes, they're all on the left. But by the time we got to the fall of the Berlin Wall, and again, I was studying political science at the time, at the very least in high school, you got article after article after article of major political scientists saying, well, we finally reached that point. There's only one liberal strain left in the entire world, and that is liberal democracy. And therefore, it is simply going to take over the entire globe. We are the winners. And to some extent, they drank their own Kool-Aid, they believed their own lies, and they said, we don't need an enemy to point to anymore. Sure, we have to clean up a couple of spaces around the globe. One of those spaces would be the Middle East and certain religions that come out of that area. Sure, that needs to be cleaned up, but they'll just be swept away, and global liberal democracy will rule the entire world. That was the tenor of the most prominent political theorists and political scientists at that time. While the rest of us peons, little people, the grassroots, were looking at it going, yeah, no. Now that there is no enemy for you to point to, and we're looking at what you want, I don't want what you want either. Your narrative doesn't work. And that's all to say that the conservative way of looking at this, the traditionalist way of looking at this, began probably a decade and a half minimum before your progressives tried to switch up the narrative. The traditionalists are certainly aware of the foundational cracks within the myth of World War II, but they simply did not have any institutional power in order to try to install a new myth. Quite honestly, they wouldn't do that anyways, because the traditionalist way of looking at it isn't let's institute a myth, it's let's get back to the truth. Now, I've been yammering on about cultural things probably for quite a while now. Let's look at some real world examples of this just for a minute. When thinking about this, I actually started to think mostly about video games. In the fact that I was around when the first video games came out, they were fairly simple and fairly tame and were what you might call fairly juvenile. They were things like Donkey Kong or Cubert or Dig Dug or Pitfall. And if you didn't live through it, you might not understand the impact of the first-person shooter on video games and how it drastically changed the entire tone of video games. And how were they able to put out something which was deemed so violent at the time? Well, they did so by giving you enemies, and by the way, this barely worked, but by giving you enemies that you could kill that no one really cared if you killed. And they would usually be only three in nature. They would be the undead, so zombies basically, or demons, or Nazis. One of those three. So going back to games like Wolfenstein, Doom, Heretic, you can see this World War II myth sticking up its head. Why? Because you had the undead, which was basically husks of what used to live, anti-life. You had demons, which were the personification of evil, and then you had Nazis, which was a combination of the two. Why? Because storytelling was based upon the foundational myth of World War II. Growing up as Gen X, there were World War II movies everywhere. Sure, it morphed into more Vietnam-based stuff within the 80s, anything from Magnum to Rambo to Hamburger Hill. But before that, and usually in the background, all you would have is World War II movies. It's funny, I was just discussing this with John over at John's Long Box just last week. It kind of hit me because I collect old media, physical media, and so I collect DVDs. And I said to him, it's funny. I go to a lot of yard sales, thrift shops, that kind of thing, to pick up DVDs. And the one thing that I can consistently find there is World War II movies. And quite honestly, just look at the success of the MCU. Sure, there were some successful MCU movies and proto-MCU movies for a bit. But what was the foundation of, we're going to build a continuity, a series of movies all centered around this Marvel myth. What was that movie? Well, that was Captain America, the first Avenger, which is what? Him in World War II. So I could go on like that all day. That's what I usually do on my live streams on Wednesday, by the way. But I think that's sufficient. If you don't, put some more examples in the comments. And let's get back to our topic. Now, to see the strains of why this World War II foundational myth can't be used anymore isn't simply because it's going out of living memory. It's because there was a foundational principle upon which it was built that simply isn't true. And the thing was that when it was being presented in the last 100 years, you couldn't really see that crack in its armor, but you can now. Why? Because the narrative of the progressives, which they tried to use to substitute for the cracking World War II myth, is based upon the exact same flawed principle. Quite honestly, the progressive narrative is not really a new narrative. It is simply a continuation of the World War II narrative as if it was the successor of that narrative. If you're looking at it in story terms, it will be the difference between stories of the ancient Greek titans and then the ancient Greek gods. They do constitute one large narrative, even though there's a significant shift between the two. The titans would be the World War II myth. The gods, in their eyes, would be the new progressive narrative. And oh, by the way, while I'm speaking of mythology, I'll quickly answer the question of why do I think that this quote-unquote progressive narrative is broken and not going to work? Why? Because they have tried to institute foundational events for their narrative, which no one pays any attention to. Like what? Like the death of Mr. Floyd. Like January 6th. They've tried to institute these as almost new holidays for the support of their foundational myth. And the news media and the entire entertainment system has been trying to push them over and over again as these are significant turning points in our history. And everybody else is looking at them going, yeah, whatever. But to get back to the point of why this narrative and its preceding narrative simply cannot be used anymore, just look at the progressive narrative and see exactly what the problem is. The problem is these quote-unquote progressive people are anything but. They tout the fact that they are the tip of the spear, the flag bearers of change, when they are, quite literally, trying to bring our entire society to a dead stagnation. In one form or another, whether it be full bore or simply thinking about it in Star Trek terms, they're trying to bring about a utopian mindset within their followers because they're trying to get to a utopia. That's what they're progressing towards. That's what the progress in progressive actually means. They're progressing towards what they see as utopia. But the problem with utopia is, once you get there, you do realize things don't change. If you got there, society would not be allowed to grow and change and adapt in the way that a living organism would. It would only be allowed to so-called grow and change and adapt according to the foundational principle of progressivism. And that founding principle of progressivism is the same founding principle of the World War II myth. And the World War II myth is simply looking at World War I and World War II, seeing the massive casualties and destruction that occurred during that time, seeing the creation of instruments of war that could devastate the entire planet, and to say from that, we can never allow this to happen again. But here's the thing. How do you institute a society wherein it can never happen again? Well, you simply control that society. You don't allow that society to go in certain directions. That's what the League of Nations and the UN after it are built upon. That's what the international order, no matter where it came from, has been built upon for the last 100 years, is to say that we cannot allow this to happen again. And how do we do that? We do it by controlling society. And that, again, is the strain that continues on into the progressive narrative. And what's the problem with that kind of thinking? Well, the problem is it is diametrically opposed to the way that people thought prior, well, I would say prior to World War I. But honestly, World War I was just the breaking point. There was a admixture of two different kinds of thinking before that, which were fighting for control. Because the idea, certainly of the medievals, and running straight into the modern period, getting less and less, but running into it, was the idea that war, while tragic and should be avoided, the reason why it should be avoided was because it was a failure of the political. It was a failure of mankind. It was a failure of the individuals who controlled your government. But the modern way of looking at it, and again, this is what we were taught within political science. The modern way of looking at war is the fact that it's inevitable and it's actually a part of politics. It's not a failure, it's simply an extension of politics. If politics in two different regions bump up against each other and they can't agree on certain things, then you turn to diplomacy. If diplomacy doesn't work, then the extension of diplomacy is war. And to hammer that home, it is the difference between the old way of thinking, that war is the failure of politics, and the new modern way of thinking, that war is an extension of politics. And where does this distinction come from? Why was there a break in this kind of mentality that war is a failure of politics? Why did they get rid of that? Well, they got rid of that because of the little story I told a couple of minutes ago about the rising tide of the liberal mentality for the last 500 years. Its control for the last 200 years. Its infighting amongst itself for the last 100, 150 years. Because the liberal mentality and the old mentality, we'll just call it the medieval mentality, but it's not just medieval, is the distinction of how you look at human beings and the societies within which they live. Neither side would disagree with the fact that there needs to be some kind of stability within your society in order for it to continue to exist. But where does that stability come from? Well, in the old way of thinking, the traditional way of thinking, the medieval and ancient way of thinking, which, yes, does run somewhat into the modern period, but in a decreasing influence over and over as the years go by, was the fact that that stability comes from the nature of human beings. That human beings have a fixed human nature. You can study that. You can apply it to something like history and look at where and how mistakes were made and then try to avoid them in the future. And thus, the system of control wherein that stability for your society was gained was a system of virtue, was a system of self-control. Now, does that always work out that way? No, but that was the ideal. The system of self-control of the citizens through virtue would allow for the stability for their society to continue to grow, to live and grow. But once you flip that around with the liberal mentality, the mentality that human beings have nothing that fixes them in place. There's nothing that tells you what you should and shouldn't do. There is no compunction to act in a virtuous way at all. You are free. You are liberated from all of those old ideas. Once you get to that point, you remove the stability from that point and you place it somewhere else. Where do you place it? Well, there has to be stability, so you place it on the society itself. Sure, you as an individual can do whatever it is you want, but we're going to clamp down on you and make sure your society is stagnant and doesn't grow because there needs to be stability. And that's what we've seen for the last 100 years. That's what we've seen, certainly, within storytelling over the last 50, 60 years. These quote-unquote progressive people, what are they doing? What they're trying to do is to take every instance of change, every instance of growth, and either negate it or bend it to their will so that it serves the progressive narrative. Or, prior to progressives really taking control of our entertainment systems, serve the World War II narrative. and that World War II narrative is, we can't allow societies to grow and change. We just can't. It will lead to the extinction of humankind. We need to control that growth, hamper it, negate it, make sure that it never leads to any kind of conflict, because, of course, war is the natural extension of politics. It will naturally go in that way. And this mythology went straight through our culture, went straight through our stories, went straight through the narrative of our living. You want a devil to blame everything on? A anti-life demonic force? Look at 1930s Germany. You want to know where the end times will come about? Well, it'll come about in a blinding nuclear flash if you allow war to take place. Do you want a system of morality? Sure. That system is you get to do as an individual whatever it is you want to do. You just got to allow us to clamp down on your society as a whole, to smother it with more and more rules, more and more oppression through those rules, so that you then see life lived in a panopticon of being constantly surveilled and controlled as the way things should be. And so we finally get to the point of, how do we extract ourselves from this dead zone of entertainment? Well, we can't go back. As much as I love older entertainment, as much as I look at it and tout those kinds of stories as 10, 20, 100 times better than anything you'll see today, we can't go back. And we can't go back because we've seen where it leads to. Progressivism and its attempt to dominate culture in every form is not an accidental ending point of this entire thing. It is the only ending point of this entire thing. And so the only true path forward is to go back to the traditional idea of a hero, because a traditional idea of a hero is a paragon of virtue. And so the stories we need to tell ourselves about ourselves is one where each individual human being is taught to control themselves through the pursuit of virtue so that society itself can live and grow and live up to the ancient, noble narrative of the shining city on the hill. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there is a link in the description for my new books which are coming out called Fade to Blue. If you go over there, you can watch the trailer for Fade to Blue, look at some of the art, and leave your email address so that you can be informed when the project goes live. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.